Hello, my name's Dave Emery, and it's my pleasure and privilege to present to you Christopher Simpson, the author of, among other titles, The Science of Coercion, published in hardcover and softcover by the Oxford University Press, copyright 1994. Chris, welcome to our airwaves.
Thanks, Dave.
Let me begin, first of all, by thanking you for your work, not only The Science of Coercion that we're about to discuss, but also your landmark work, Blowback, and The Splendid Blonde Beast, both of which I've read and my audience is familiar with, and I think, shall we say, history or society owe you more than they're likely to be able to repay.
I think that's a little bit overstated. I think that I've been repaid pretty well. Your audience might be interested in another book. This is not a book that one would buy in a bookstore, but it is available in libraries and that sort of thing. It's a collection of declassified National Security Council records from the Reagan and Bush administration. And it gives a pretty good overview of what contemporary U.S. security policy is, in the words of the National Security Council and the President themselves.
The title of the book again?
It's a ponderous title, National Security Directives of the Reagan and Bush administration.
I believe I've heard of that. In any event,
it's a reference book. It's not something to buy in a bookstore, but ask for it at a library.
Certainly, there is an awful lot to be researched yet about those years, and in fact, I think that research will hopefully take up an awful lot of literary space and time. Speaking of both, we have to move along here, and let's get to the subject of your remarkable book, The Science of Coercion. In this work, you collate two basic concepts or elements of contemporary American society: psychological warfare and mass communication research. Chris, why don't we start by providing a working definition of each?
Psychological warfare it first entered the English language as a translation and a mutation of a Nazi German concept called Weltanschauungskrieg, which means worldview warfare. And during World War II, the Americans built on that and expanded it and so forth, and used it to mean a whole range of tactics, wartime-type tactics involving propaganda, dirty tricks, covert operations, whatever, to carry out the war. Where it emerges into our modern reality came in the wake of the war, when more so-called peacetime type versions of essentially the same tactics emerged. For years now, of course, the government has told us that we're living in the world of no war, no peace. And what that has meant as a practical matter is that we're living in a world of ongoing low-level warfare. One of the early terms that was used to describe this is psychological warfare. Nowadays they call it so-called low-intensity warfare. Sometimes it's called, in a more polite form, public diplomacy, and so on. Just to build on that point for a minute, when you hear people talking about low-intensity warfare, it simply means low intensity compared to nuclear weapons. Low-intensity warfare, from the standpoint of people who are subjected to it, is quite high intensity. Thank you very much. Some people would refer to it as total warfare conducted at the grassroots level. It's basically a form of terror against union organizers. I'm talking about Central America now. Union organizers, church people, community activists of whatever sort. In Central America alone, you're talking about fatalities measured in the hundreds of thousands. All right, communication research is the sort of ivory tower version of much the same sort of thing. There are schools of communication research at most major universities in the United States. Sometimes it's folded into the sociology department. But in any case, it is a box of preconceptions and of tools, preconceptions about what communication is, and of tools for studying communication. And these preconceptions and tools are used to train journalists, public relations specialists, television and radio personalities, all sorts of people, in college professors, I'm talking about myself now, all sorts of people who might be called ideological workers in U.S. society, people whose day-to-day profession it is to shape other people's ideology and ideas. Communication research is very much tied up with that because it is in part, it provides methods for measuring how successful these types of ideological campaigns have been.
We should make the point that psychological warfare does not in any way preclude the use of deadly force, that the type of warfare that is called psychological warfare is warfare that is generated for the specific purpose of producing its primary reaction in the psychological field. This does not necessarily, however, imply that no blood is shed.
By no means. And in fact, from its inception, and from its earliest definition in classified government records, psychological warfare is defined to include assassinations, covert operations, guerrilla warfare, counterinsurgency, and so forth and so on. From its inception, psychological warfare has been the mating of violence on the one hand and what people would call today propaganda or communication, mass communication on the other hand. Another thing that's interesting about psychological warfare, from its inception, it has also targeted the people of the United States. The common preconception is well, for better or worse, this is something that we do to them. Or words to that effect. But the reality is from the government standpoint, from the standpoint of those who were paying the bills for its development, the targets always involve not only foreign audiences, but domestic audiences as well.
One of the points that we should perhaps make just in passing is that, again, the illusion that psychological warfare does not necessarily produce bloodshed or is not necessarily very bloody appears to have contributed to one of the rationalizations that some of the people who bridge the gap between psychological warfare and mass communication research had used. They rationalized their utilization of psychological warfare by saying that this would lead to a reduction of bloodshed or less violent methods of coercion.
Sure. And there are circumstances in which that is true. And for example, if you have a group of a battalion of surrounded troops, and you can use leaflets and loudspeakers to convince them that they're better off surrendering than fighting to the death, then in that type of circumstance, psychological warfare can, in fact, reduce bloodshed. But that's a very limited part of how these techniques are actually used. The main the main application, both measured in terms of how often and how much money is spent on it, how much academic attention is given to it, the main use of psychological warfare has been the suppression of rebellious, pro-democratic movements in countries that the United States government felt that it wanted to dominate. Most generally because of the natural resources of the country, sometimes because of the the geostrategic position of the country. That's what psychological warfare has actually been used for, and sometimes that's meant beating up union organizers. Sometimes it's meant death squads. Sometimes it's meant systematic training of police organizations. And of course, as time has passed, I mean, it's been more than 50 years since 1945 now, and the science, if you will, has not stood still in that time. As this has become more and more sophisticated, new techniques have emerged to both intensify the violence and to divorce or to separate the sponsoring country or organization from responsibility for the violence. This was one of the big lessons of Vietnam from the standpoint of American security planners, is that you kept American troops out of the line of fire to the maximum degree possible. It's because there was a political price to pay if too many kids came home in body bags. So what do? Well, you send down the Green Berets to train and equip the Salvadoran police force, or their treasury police, which then becomes an organized form of death squad to carry out a quite bloody civil war in El Salvador that lasted for a decade during the 1980s. And El Salvador is as horrifying as that war was, it's just one name on the list. There are many other examples like that have unfolded over the last 20 or 30 years.
In your discussion of psychological warfare, Chris, you talk about white propaganda, black propaganda, and gray propaganda. Mm-hmm. Do you think it would perhaps be appropriate to discuss the role of some of these personages and institutions that are involved on the one hand with psychological warfare and on the other hand with mass communication research as perhaps a form of gray propaganda?
Sure. Well, part of what the book argues is that this area of academic study and the various schools that are connected to it and the body of knowledge that is connected to it, and most importantly, the preconceptions that are connected to it. I'm talking about communication research now. The preconceptions that are tied up with communication research emerged in very important part due to government psychological warfare funding at the height of the Cold War.
Chris, could I ask you briefly to jump in with a definition of gray propaganda for our listeners?
Okay. Well, to understand gray propaganda, you got to address white and black propaganda. Right. White propaganda is like the Voice of America, for example. White propaganda is depending upon one's point of view, is like NBC News. It is information that is repeated constantly, that has the appearance of veracity, objectivity, naturalness, and so on, but which in fact has a distinct ideological subtext, a distinct set of preconceptions about the message that one is trying to put across. Black propaganda, on the other hand, is what most people would call covert operations. Assassinations, insurgencies, counterinsurgencies, dirty tricks of a variety of sorts, sabotage, the Contra affair in Nicaragua, and then building on that the whole Iran-Contra business, and then building on that the whole business of the Contras in Iran and the drugs. Those would be examples of black propaganda. Gray propaganda, to get to your question, exists somewhere between the two, and it has characteristics of both. The most common type of gray propaganda is where the organization that's sponsoring it puts disinformation, misinformation into the news media that has the appearance of being independent from that sponsoring organization. Rather simple example of this would come from, say, if the CIA puts here, I'll give you an example I saw myself, is back when Libya was America's worst enemy. Apparently they've come down on the list of our worst enemies in recent years, but back when Gaddafi was supposedly the most dangerous man in the world, the CIA had a psychological warfare campaign to paint him as sexually impotent, as somebody who had a variety of sexual fetishes and so forth and so on. Well, they planted this information as though it were truth in European newspapers. And then that's gray propaganda, right? Mm-hmm. The next step is that type of thing blows back into the United States and Americans' conceptions of what's going on. I remember quite vividly a cover story in one of the supermarket tabloids that presented exactly this story about Gaddafi at the time that Gaddafi was supposedly our big enemy. Like many psychological operations, this eventually blew up in the face of the people who were sponsoring it, and was exposed as having been a misinformation campaign. So that if you're sharp enough and if you care enough to watch the little details of the comings and goings of the CIA and people of this type, then you can see perfectly well what's going on. But for most of us, we don't have time to do that. We're trying to raise families, we're trying to go to work and get through the day and so on, and so we get this barrage of information, fake information usually, from the media that takes on the appearance of being true. When in reality it is manufactured, if you will, by people who have a story to promote. And by and large, the manufacturing is done by people who have the money to pay public relations firms and so forth and so on to put their story out. Those of us who don't have the money to hire our own public relations agent and so on, have a little bit more difficult time getting access to the media. Now your program, Dave, I know gets out pretty well, but fair is fair. I mean, the truth is that not too many people. Certainly, Dave Embry compared to Dan Rather, it's Dan has got a bigger audience. I mean, we just have to deal with that reality.
Oh, it certainly is. One of my favorite expressions is an old Turkish proverb that he who tells the truth gets chased out of 9 villages.
Very interesting.
Chris, you talk about the interrelationship between psychological warfare and mass communication research as involving 3 major types of intersections. One, you discuss psychological warfare, or U.S. psychological warfare, as in many ways applied communication research. By the same token, much of the funding for mass communication research has come from national security-related institutions, and that this in turn has had much to do with shaping the post-World War II nature of mass communication research as an academic discipline. And you trace the genesis of this relationship to a number of different institutions which were centers of psychological warfare during the Second World War. I'd like to briefly read a quote from page 25 of the Science of Coercion and then ask you to develop this further. On page 25 you write, Virtually all of the scientific community that was to emerge during the 1950s as leaders in the field of mass communication research spent the war years performing applied studies on U.S. and foreign propaganda, Allied troop morale, public opinion both domestically and internationally, clandestine OSS operations, or the then emerging technique of deriving useful intelligence from analysis of newspapers, magazines, radio broadcasts, and postal censorship intercepts. This old boy network had much to do with shaping the immediate post-World War II academic discipline of mass communication research as well as psychological warfare.
Sure. Yeah, well, I think you covered those bases pretty well, and one of the things that came out of that type of World War II era cooperation. Now, World War II was a particular type of war. I mean, Studs Terkel wrote a book called The Good War, and I'm not sure that any war can be described as good, but the point that he was trying to make is that it was a time in which the country was unambiguously united for the purpose of defeating a clearly evil power, and that really has not been the case. Certainly, it's been a far more complicated situation since 1945. Anyway, so during the war, you have these networks of psychological operations specialists are created. Moving into the Cold War period, the networks persist. And, for example, people who were quite influential during the wartime period, then some of them move on to be the directors and the senior scientists at the main foundations, like the Ford Foundation and the Rockefeller Brothers Fund and the Social Science Research Council and so forth, which is a major source of money for sociological research. On the other hand, some of the others went into publishing, broadcasting, and so on. And here's a quote from Edward Barrett. Edward Barrett ended up as dean of the graduate school of journalism at Columbia University and founder of the Columbia Journalism Review and so forth. Here's Barrett talking about where his colleagues from the Office of War Information ended up. As of 1953, he's talking now. He says they include the publishers of Time, Look, Fortune, and several daily newspapers, he means, editors of magazines such as Holiday, Coronet, Parade, and Saturday Review. I don't know how many of your listeners are going to remember Coronet, but once upon a time, that was quite an influential magazine. Editors of the Denver Post and New Orleans Times-Picayune and others, heads of Viking Press, Harper & Brothers, Farrar, Straus and Young, 2 Hollywood Oscar winners, a 2-time Pulitzer Prize winner, the board chairman of CBS, and a dozen key network executives, President Eisenhower's chief speechwriter, the editor of Reader's Digest International Editions, and at least 6 partners of large advertising agencies. The point being here that not that all these people thought alike, and not that they were engaged in some big conspiracy or something like that, but rather that they had a common wartime experience and a series of common preconceptions about what communication is and how it was supposed to be used and how it could be studied and so on, that has had enormous impact on what we today take to be communication. Now, this word communication is a it's trickier, or it's more it's richer in meaning than it seems at first. The root word comes from Latin, com and munia, which means sharing of burdens. The spirit there is in a two-way exchange of information, a two-way sharing of burdens. Now, of course, that doesn't mean the burdens in Roman times were necessarily equally shared, but nonetheless, this basic characteristic of communication as having a two-way character or a multi-way character remains true. And you see it in other words that are related to it, like commune or communion and so on. But nowadays, communication, particularly the way it's taught in schools, but also the way it's used in commercial enterprises, has quite a different meaning. It means how I can tell you what to do.
Chris, I'd like to read very briefly a quote from page 62 of The Science of Coercion, which I think addresses the point that you're developing. You write on page 62, as will become apparent, the dominant paradigm, unquote, of the period proved to be in substantial part a paradigm of dominance in which the appropriateness and inevitability of elite control of communication was taken as a given. As a practical matter, the key academic journals of the day demonstrated only a secondary interest in what communication is, quote unquote. Instead, they concentrated on how modern technology could be used by elites to manage social change, extract political concessions, or win purchasing decisions from targeted audiences. I think that's a very different type of communication than the root definition that you've been giving us.
Sure, that's right. And I think, now getting back to like one of the themes that we started with is that has to do with this interlocking relationship between that type of communication that you've just described and violence. And are they really linked together, or is this just something that I'm asserting? And let me give you an example of two examples of how they are linked together.
By the way, Chris, we've got about 2 minutes left on this side. This side of the cassette.
You're talking about the side of a tape, huh?
Right, then we have another half hour of the interview.
Okay, so I'll tell you what. Yeah. Why don't you just go ahead and turn over the tape, and then we'll get into it.
Okay, sounds like a very good idea. We've been speaking with Christopher Simpson, the author of The Science of Coercion, published in softcover by the Oxford University Press, copyright 1994, subtitled, by the way, Communication Research and Psychological Warfare. For Chris Simpson, this is Dave Emery saying thanks for listening. Hello, my name's Dave Emery, and once again, it's my privilege to present to you Christopher Simpson, the author of The Science of Coercion, subtitled Communication Research and Psychological Warfare, 1945 to 1960, published in hard and softcover by the Oxford University Press. Chris, welcome back to our airwaves.
Thanks. I'm glad to be here.
We've been discussing what literally could be called a networking of social scientists and national security institutions and personages, which had its development with development during World War II, and then evolved in the post-World War II period to effect what perhaps might be called a synthesis of social science and national security operations. You discuss an old boy network stemming from World War II that we touched on in the first half hour of our interview, and then you trace the concretization, to coin a term, of this relationship between psychological warfare and communication research with the development of the post-World War II national security state through such NSC documents as NSC directives as NSC 4, 4A, and 10/2. Could you briefly discuss those for us?
Sure. NSC, of course, is the National Security Council, and they're the principal advisors to the President on national security issues. That got set up mainly because up until the end of the Roosevelt administration, you had the military advisors kind of shouting in one corner and the political advisors shouting in the other, and the President Roosevelt was crafty enough to handle both, but as the New World emerged, Truman and his successors wanted a staff to combine the military and the political questions into a single group of advisors. And back in the beginning, one of the very first things that this combined staff did was to work on the question or the issue of psychological warfare and the combination of propaganda on the one hand and violence on the other hand. And an example of this is NSC, which means simply National Security Council, document number 4. And what it said was that, now this was rated confidential. And those of you who are sort of government national security buffs know that a confidential document is the lowest level of government secret, and tens of thousands of government employees have access to it. And so while it is nominally, officially, and even legally a secret, quote unquote, as a practical matter, confidential information is seen on the front page of newspapers virtually every day, and that has been the case for decades. So NSC-4 was a confidential decision that said, well, we have to set up psychological warfare operations to counter the Russians, and this will consist of what was the predecessor of the U.S. Information Agency and the early Voice of America, and so on. So psychological warfare, in this officially secret but really public definition, was hard-hitting propaganda. Was the way it was presented, and you saw it written up in those terms in U.S. News and World Report and magazines of that sort. Well, minutes after deciding on NSC-4 as a confidential decision, the National Security Council took up NSC-4A, which was a top secret decision. And a top secret classification is considerably stricter than confidential, and one of its aspects is that the very existence of a top secret decision is secret, so that no government official can legally acknowledge that a top secret decision to do this thing or that thing has been made. Well, NSC-4A said that these little propaganda operations, USIA, the Voice of America, and so forth, would be supplemented by systematic campaigns of sabotage, guerrilla warfare, covert operations, assassination, insurgency, counterinsurgency, and so forth. And that the authority to do this at the stage of NSC-4A was pretty vague. It's because the different security agencies were still arguing over who would get the brief to carry out this type of warfare. And the decision on that came about 6 months later with a decision that was called NSC 10/2. And again, your CIA buffs are probably pretty familiar with 10/2. That was created an entirely secret government agency. Its name was the Office for Policy Coordination, and the function of this entirely secret government agency was specifically to carry out these types of covert operations that I mentioned just a moment ago. That secret government agency eventually became the so-called Operations Directorate of the CIA, which has basically the same functions to this day.
One of the institutions that you mention as exemplifying this marriage of social science and warfare and propaganda is Public Opinion Quarterly, a very influential academic journal which in many ways epitomizes this bridging of that gap.
Right. Yeah, and I would like to talk about Public Opinion Quarterly, but to get at this whole question of the interplay between the academic and violence, I think it's necessary to take a step even further back than that, and that is to look at how mass consumer societies spread themselves, how they work. Now, okay, we live in a mass consumer society today. I mean, the thing runs on how many Fords or Toyotas or cans of Coca-Cola or whatever it is that the various manufacturers can sell to their audiences. And most of the mass media, the real job that most of the mass media is involved in is the business of selling eyeballs to advertisers. and it's all broken out rather precisely. You know, if you want to buy advertising on Seinfeld, or just to pick a show, it doesn't matter which one, 60 Minutes, the network can tell you with great precision how many million men between the ages of 16 and 25 watch this program, how many million women between the ages of 25 and 35 watch this program, and so forth and so on. And so you can see, if you watch particularly the sitcoms, you can see precisely in the advertising precisely who it's aimed at. So that what a TV station really does is not put on entertainment. Where its money comes from is in selling your eyeballs to advertisers. In order to do that, in order to make that work, there has to be ways to count how many eyeballs are being sold. There have to be ways to survey this and to put forward a plausible argument from the media side to the advertisers as to why the advertisers should come up with $1 billion a year or whatever it is to sell cosmetics, for example, or comparable numbers to sell automobiles and so on. All right. Well, where the academic field of mass communication research began was in the development of these techniques to do precisely that type of measurement, to measure how many eyeballs or how many ears in those years, because we're talking about radio when the thing originated, we're looking at particular advertisements and what impact this had on sales, and to what degree did the person reading an advertisement remember that advertisement, and so forth and so on. There are lots and lots of studies that you can find in the library that elaborate on these themes. Now, to come around to the question of violence, what we've seen since the 1930s, with the expansion of this type of consumer society, and I'm not even talking about a left or right, or whether one is capitalist or another is socialist, or any of that stuff. I'm talking about the expansion of mass consumer society around the world. What one has seen is that type of society precludes, it overwhelms other forms of social organization. It cuts them out and proceeds rather frequently with great violence, often including genocide, particularly genocide of indigenous peoples, as it spreads around the world. As it spreads, it carries particular ideas with it, particular preconceptions about what's good and what's bad about the world and how things work and so forth. Now, we can go on for another hour about consumer societies and so on. But the point that I'm trying to get around to here is, number one, for consumer society to run, there has to be some way to measure what's being bought and sold. Number two, for it to expand, it expands only at the expense of existing societies. And number three, that as it overwhelms an existing society, say as it arrives in Turkey or Lebanon or Egypt or in Southeast Asia or in Peru, it breaks down the existing social structure and instead substitutes itself. And this sets off a chain of both frequently damage to the people who live there and also resistance to these developments. So how do you manage the resistance to the arrival of Coca-Cola and Ford Motor Company and so forth? When the local unions, when the local social activists, when the local churches decide they've had it about up to here with what the foreign companies are trying to push onto them, how do you manage these people? Well, then that comes around to the question of psychological warfare and the whole theory of how development, quote unquote, economic development, comes about. The main centers of communication research during the 1950s and 1960s were obsessed with this question of, well, what do you do if people in Egypt don't like the products that you're trying to sell them? What if they're restless? How do you keep them in line? The first step, of course, is that you broadcast radio programs or television programs or something that in one way or another, either in nice words or in nasty words, well, you guys better keep in line. That's the first step. And then when that doesn't work, what's the next step? Well, you've got carrots and sticks, so you have some economic development and so on. But there's also the stick. And what the stick is police and military violence, particularly counterinsurgency, particularly so-called low-intensity warfare. Methods to identify the dissidents in these various societies and to eliminate them. And by the 1990s, this process of identifying and quite literally eliminating people who are seen as inconvenient to the expansion of particularly of American interests around the world. This has become high science, and you see it operating most particularly in Central and South America today.
Chris, jumping ahead to something that follows fairly logically from the discussion that we've just been engaging in, you discuss, and you write on page 53 as follows: at least a half dozen of the most important centers of U.S. communication research depended for their survival on funding from a handful of national security agencies. Their reliance on psychological warfare money was so extensive as to suggest that the crystallization of mass communication studies into a distinct scholarly field might not have come about during the 1950s without substantial military, CIA, and U.S. information agency intervention. One of the 6 institutions that you talk about is the Center for International Studies at MIT, and in connection with mass communication and what it does to societies, could I ask you to talk about development theory, which is actually a term which it has a mass communication research applicability and also a national security applicability?
Development theory is it's an interdisciplinary theory. You know, this is very much the fond dream of academics, is to have these interdisciplinary developments. It combines communication research, sociology, political science, bits and pieces of psychology, and so on. And its idea is to figure out. It's really a quite an arrogant idea, to figure out some sort of formula by which every country in the world would develop, quote unquote, along the lines that the hegemonic power, which, given that this particular bit of research was being done in the United States, involved the United States, along the lines that the hegemonic power wanted it to develop. Now, there was a Cold War going on. The Americans weren't the only players in this game. And what happened was that the various developing countries of the world, countries that had come out from under colonial yoke and so on, were caught in this crossfire, mainly between the Russians and the Americans, and to their great disadvantage. Even Pope John Paul II, who is no radical by any stretch of the imagination, has argued that this so-called development in the midst of the Cold War has, in truth, been extraordinarily damaging to most of the people in the world, and most particularly to the people in those countries that became centers of contention between East and West. Development theory was what the so-called best and brightest of the West attempted to work out as a sort of a general strategy, a unified field theory, so to speak, of how these types of crises were going to be managed.
One of the institutions which served to a large extent as a vehicle for the weighing and communication of some of the concepts such as development theory developed by the CENIS is the aforementioned Public Opinion Quarterly, and that publication in many ways epitomizes the crossover between psychological warfare and communication research. Could I ask you to discuss the 1952 issue on international communication research, which could perhaps be described as something of a covert operation in and of itself?
Sure. Yes, and this gets back to a question you raised earlier, which I went drifting off into another subject and didn't really get around to answering your question before. Public Opinion Quarterly is a very well-known academic journal that specializes in how public opinion is measured. And during the early 1950s, it was really rather straightforward in that it viewed itself as participating in psychological warfare. And it would publish articles describing what the various tactics of the West had been against the Germans during World War II and that sort of thing. That was on the first and sort of most obvious level. The next level, which is what I think you're getting at, Dave, is that journal itself promoted particular attitudes about what communication is, what society is, and even down to such things as what's the correct line on a strategy for dealing with the Russians or the Italians or you name it.
Right. I was thinking of some of the work that Warren Walsh, for example, did in POQ.
Right. So the journal itself was although it didn't present itself in these terms, as a practical matter, it was a propaganda organ, if you will. And then on the third level, what one sees is a very close inbreeding between the senior editors and the editorial board of the journal on the one hand, and the intelligence agencies on the other hand. The founder of the journal back in 1937 was a man by the name of DeWitt Poole, who was then on sabbatical from the State Department, and his specialty was anti-communist propaganda. I mean, that's what he did for a living. And he, moving into the post-war period, he eventually became a senior executive with the Radio Free Europe, Radio Liberty operations that were funded by the CIA. In that particular issue of the journal, it's a quarterly journal, so I mean, it came out 4 times a year. But the one that you're talking about, there were a series of interesting reports, including one that presented itself as though it was simply communication research, and the title. I'm paraphrasing the title now. This is not exactly it, but the gist of it was extremists in Iran, communication and extremists in Iran. And if you're sitting there looking at the book, Dave, you might be able to give me the exact words. Well, who were these extremists? Well, what was going on was that the Voice of America was paying a very well-known, very liberal think tank in New York called the Bureau of Applied Social Research to study dissident groups in the Middle East. And this particular study that we're discussing looked at so-called extremists in Iran. And who those people were supporters of Mohammad Mossadegh, who was at the time the leader of Iran, but he was out of favor from the West. It's because he had this extraordinary idea, shocking idea, that Iran should control its own oil resources. So now this did not go down very well with the Americans or with the British, and eventually they engineered a coup d'etat that overthrew Mossadegh and his supposed extremist followers and installed the Shah of Iran. So what you see in the academic journal, the sort of the mirror of this, as it appears in the academic literature, is a article that has lots of footnotes, and it has the vocabulary, and it has the whole sort of image of heavy academic research. But what it is in truth is a report on applied political covert operation where these guys went out and attempted to get the lay of the land so that the coup d'etat to overthrow Mossadegh would go more smoothly.
By the way, I have the title of that article. It's Political Extremists in Iran, a Secondary Analysis of Communications Data, and that was authored by Benjamin Ringer and David Sills. And as you point out, it was simply an adjunct to an then ongoing covert operation against Mossadegh in Iran.
Mm-hmm. That's right. And you see that same sort of, we've been talking about a three-level pattern here, where you have articles that are officially and literally about psychological warfare. Psychological warfare report on how we convinced the Japanese on Saipan to surrender in World War II. Okay, an official psychological warfare study. Then you have the next level of propaganda to social scientists to convince them to toe a particular line, and then you have this third level where the publications of social science themselves become tools for intelligence gathering, or as illustrated in this particular case, as elements of covert operations.
You discuss also the Hook insurgency in the Philippines and similar articles that functioned in connection with that covert operation, right. And some of these operations were quite bloody. Chris, we're down to the last 3 minutes or so of our interview, and I'd like to read a sentence from page 85 and then ask you to comment on the effects of some of these relationships on the methodological paradigms of communication research. On page 85 you write, "This continuity of leading theoreticians became part of a broader pattern through which the psychological warfare, unquote, of one generation became the, quote, international communication, unquote, of the next." And you talk about one of the effects of the relationship between mass communication research and psychological warfare as sort of an internal purge of dissident voices, so to speak, not by the government, but by the recipients of this government largesse or positive feedback. And then you discuss the effects of this on the developing zeitgeist or dominant paradigm of communication research.
Right. And somebody who is as professional a radio personality as you are, Dave, you might be able to wrap that up in 3 minutes, but I'll tell you the truth, I cannot do it in 3 minutes. But what I will say is this, is that what one saw was in the early Cold War, they talked about psychological warfare straight up. They were pretty frank about the whole thing. By the mid-1950s, they realized that if you talked about, we're engaged in psychological warfare against the Italians, that the Italians may not like that very much, and they may take exception to it. So the rhetoric of the field began to change. And there was an example coming out of Columbia University, as I recall, in which a long bibliography of what psychological warfare was, examples of it, definitions, case studies, and so forth, had been prepared secretly during the early 50s, and then eventually published in 1955 or 1956. And the only difference between the 1953 version that was talking about psychological operations in the 1956 version was that the title had been changed. And the new title was International Communication. The rhetoric of the field was changing, but the content of the field was not changing, or at least the content of the field was developing along the same lines that it had developed earlier. And this is the way that the relatively straightforward use and discussion of psychological warfare as a form of violence and social control of the immediate post-1945 period became, starting in the 60s and in the 70s and up to the present day, became communication, international communication, even sometimes conflict resolution, and portrayed in these much more cushioned terms that tended to isolate the people who were using them from the realities of the world that they were in the process of creating.
Chris, we are at the end of our interview. Do you think it would be unfair to perhaps describe the situation that you just set forth for us as kinder, gentler psychological warfare?
Well, if you take into account that George Bush was not telling the truth when he said that he was a kinder, gentler Ronald Reagan.
That is exactly the point.
I think that was your point, and yeah, sure, I'll go with that.
All righty. We've been speaking with Christopher Simpson, the author of The Science of Coercion, subtitled Communication Research and Psychological Warfare 1945 through 1960, softcover and hardcover editions, Oxford University Press, copyright 1994. For Chris Simpson, this is Dave Emery saying thanks for listening.